Certainly, the law is one serious option. In fact, in cases of incitement, I think some would call it, some have referred to the law as maybe the last resort. I would go further. I would say that, if today a politician or preacher stands up and says, our country has no room for this other community, I don't think that's the time to distribute media literacy leaflets. Throw the book at him. Yeah. So the law is sometimes the first resort when it comes to clear cases of incitement. Having said that, I certainly agree with those who have expressed the need for caution and care in formulating and implementing the law. I'd like to highlight maybe a few key principles that I hope will be followed. First of all, any policy must acknowledge unintended consequences. Secondly, the policy must avoid overbreadth, such that the law does not trap what would be legitimate speech in its attempt to catch illegitimate speech. Thirdly, and I think this has not been focused on enough, to acknowledge that the law, no matter how well written, may have limited impact because of the threat of backfire. Yeah? And I'm happy to elaborate on why this backfire effect is so important to deal with, especially when talking about hate propaganda. But yes, I do agree that the committee and Parliament do need to consider whether new laws are necessary. I think it may be useful to distinguish between two different kinds of lawmaking when it concerns regulating speech. The first is, of course, the need to update your law in view of changes to technology, for example. Yeah? When the modalities change, the law needs to adapt accordingly, as we have been doing so for decades. The second, though, is changing the law to make certain classes of speech illegal that were not previously illegal. I think this is far more problematic and far more risky.
It's one of the suggestions that you make to repeal the insult laws. And the argument that you are making is that racial and religious feelings, the idea of racial and religious insult, and then by extension, intolerance and hate can be weaponized. I think that's the term that you've used. And I think your suggestion is that the weaponization is possible as a result of the presence of these laws. That's my understanding of your position, right? But that weaponization has not occurred in Singapore to date, despite the fact that we have these laws. But your contention is that in other jurisdictions with those laws, that weaponization has happened? Is that?
Yes.
Yes.
That's right.
But I'm sure you'd agree that in other jurisdictions, in the absence of such laws, race and religion have been weaponized for all kinds of purposes, including political. So the presence of the law doesn't automatically mean that it will be weaponized, and the absence doesn't automatically mean it can't be weaponized. Would you agree with that hypothesis?
Okay, let me address, you've raised a number of points, and I understand that, of course, this point is probably the most controversial point in my entire 8 pages of written testimony. So if I could walk you through my thinking on that. First of all, I should state that I understand that it is, in fact, so controversial that I don't expect you to follow it. But I feel it would be remiss of me not to register what I think is an emerging consensus, not in the West, but really in other countries that have this law, that this is a law that needs to be repealed. Yeah? In fact, just a few days ago, on Saturday, the National Law University in Delhi released its report after several years of studying hate speech legislation in India. And one of its many conclusions is that the section of the Penal Code that deals with offense, deals with the wounding of racial or religious feelings, needs to be relooked, needs to be revised. Yeah? And this is especially significant because, of course, our own Section 298 is copied and pasted directly from the Indian Penal Code. And they're not the only ones. If you look at equivalent insult laws in Indonesia, which would be blasphemy, the two leading institutes that study the growing religious intolerance in Indonesia would be the Center for the Study of Religion and Democracy, or PUSAD, at Paramedina University, the Center for Religious and Cross-Cultural Studies at Gajah Mada University. Their researchers as well, for a number of years, have pointed out that the blasphemy law is more of a problem than a solution. Yeah? So, in fact, we are an anomaly, I would say, yeah, in criminalizing the wounding of racial and religious feelings with no ill effects. And my simple question would be, are we prepared to say that we can guarantee that we won't slip into what the rest of the world has encountered, which is the weaponization of these laws? I mean, you raised the point that we have, by and large, racial and religious relations that other countries would envy. Yeah? But again, I would suggest that we shouldn't rest on our laurels and assume that the formulas that have worked in the past would work in the future. My fear really is that we may be underestimating what we're up against. Yeah? Because if you look at hate groups elsewhere in the region and elsewhere in the world, they are far more formidable than anything that we have needed to deal with. I liken this to the fact that our school teachers and principals, say, yeah, are probably not the best experts in the world in dealing with school shooting scenarios. And that's a problem of success, so to speak. They don't need to be experts at dealing with school shootings because we don't have them. You would instead need to go to the US and speak to teachers and principals there about how to handle school shootings. And I fear that when dealing with hate propaganda, for the best of reasons, it's a problem for success. We are, in fact, our policy thinking, in fact, is not as sharp as it should be. Because we have not had to deal with the kinds of threats that most of our neighbors face. Yeah? So that would be my starting point. The truth is that I do see possibilities of these more serious hate propaganda efforts that would come from a number of scenarios that so far we have been unfamiliar with. And it is for this reason that I think we need to look at the best thinking outside of Singapore among policymakers and experts that have been dealing with this for years. And I would say the consensus is that while you must have and vigorously implement and enforce incitement laws, laws that prohibit the wounding of feelings or offense or blasphemy, by and large, are a bad idea. They tend to backfire. They tend to be used by the most intolerant groups to point fingers at moderates, at people of different religions and so on, whom they accuse of insulting their feelings. For example, an intolerant Sunni majority can point to a Shia minority or to the Ahmadiyya sect and claim that these people are wounding their feelings. We have not encountered such problems before, right? But who is to say that the kinds of religious politics and racial politics that our neighbors face and are will not seep here. In the context of, for example, the growing tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, it would be reckless, I think, to assume that that kind of tension will not affect us. And there are more. There are problems of can we guarantee that China will not play up the feelings of Chinese, will not exploit the fact that Chinese minorities are there in Malaysia and Indonesia. Are we confident that that won't seep into Singapore?
But if I could perhaps crystallize a little bit, you are suggesting that we need to reconsider this about a potential problem that may arise from the perspective of other countries that have already seen the problem.
Exactly.
But they have seen this weaponization or potential weaponization of an issue that we have not seen.
Exactly.
No, I understand that perspective. But do you think that the framework that I put out just now was also a perspective that you could potentially agree with, which is that the absence of these laws does not prevent someone weaponizing these issues?
The absence of those laws does not, you're right that the absence of those laws does not prevent the weaponization of insult. but it tends to be much less damaging, much more serious when they don't have the law on their side. So this tactic of deliberately taking offense is a global phenomenon.
No, I understand.
It is deadliest when those same intolerant groups can not only point to their political enemies and say, your teachings, your place of worship, your books, etc., offend me. In addition to that, they can demand that the state take action because the law state in black and white that the state will run to your rescue if your feelings are hurt.
So the way in which the state carries out its calibrated response is an equally important component of this consideration, is it not?
Yes.
So that if this is going to work well, we need to, on the one hand, scope the issues for the threshold for intervention, as well as the way in which the state intervenes, and that you do need that opportunity to calibrate it correctly.
I caution that it would be too optimistic to put our faith in that, because I mentioned earlier that we need to think several steps ahead. States with the best of intentions will find that when they try to use these laws responsibly with restraint and so on, that itself is used as political ammunition. So typically what happens is that a group will claim that another group or book and so on is intolerable offense. Multiple police reports will ensue. The state or the courts, rightly conclude that in fact there was no serious offense. The group then points the finger at the state and says, "Aha, our followers can now see that the state is not on our side." So really the only way to avoid that kind of over-politicization is for the state to draw the line that I suggest, that of course you take action when there's incitement, but unfortunately when it comes to insult, don't go there, right? Don't attempt to, how should I put it? Don't make the mistake of policing people's feelings, because this can be, we're assuming that people will use it in good faith. The truth is, around the world, people are not using that law in good faith.